Number one, Georgia, 24.5-point favorite against Kentucky. The over-under I have is 5 reminders that this is a reunion for Brock Vandagriff in Georgia. Probably take the over. Probably take the over on that.
Mm-hmm.
I've mentioned this here before, so I'm not trying to repeat myself too much, but spent a little bit of time with Brock at Kentucky at their facility back in February. Bush Hamdan, I remember, was literally about to board the plane to come to Lexington. He had just gotten the job, and he's just, trying to learn everyone's name. Forget trying to install an offense. He's just trying to learn everyone's name. And I'm sitting there with, Susan Lax, who does tremendous work as Kentucky's SID. And she's doing the faces with the names and stuff, just so that the offensive coaches can figure this out and can kind of come in and have an idea, look at a kid and be able to identify who it is. That's the stage that they were at this place. So I'm not saying that I was there when they felt like they had the offense figured out or anything like that, because to that point, Brock Vandagriff is still just waiting on learning what type of offense he's going to be running. You could throw routes with receivers after practice and do all that stuff after workouts because it's February, but they didn't want to dig into, at that time, he didn't want to talk about that Georgia matchup. Wasn't going to talk about that in depth. It's you don't even know kind of who you're going to be from an offensive standpoint. You have an idea, but he said only super positive things about Georgia, of course, and his experience there, and how when Todd Monken got to Georgia, he's he got there, I guess, after Monken got there, but they get this playbook and it's massive, and he's looking around going, they're not going to dumb this down for us at all. This is what we got to learn. It's kind of like when you're in college and you kind of get that that syllabus and you realize we're going to be doing what every single week. That's crazy. I'm really going to have to spend a lot of time on this. But one of the things that Brock did say about facing his former team, he said it'll get here, and when it does, we'll be ready. It's here, Will, and I don't think Kentucky's ready.
They're ready.
I don't think they're ready.
You just hit on why quarterbacks never give the good quote, because you never know what you're going to be. You couldn't have anticipated getting smoked by South Carolina, but I'm here to tell you right now, even saying we're ready sounds like a bad thing.
Yep. Sounds, I don't know that I don't know that he's going to look like he's someone that is in midseason form just yet, because last we saw of him on a football field, it was ugly. I mean, there's just no sugarcoating it. It was ugly from top to bottom on the offensive side of the football. And yeah, they did a couple of things in the running game, but that was so bad from the Kentucky passing offense. There's just no world in which 6 months ago, when I had this conversation with him, that he thought he would be getting ready for Georgia while trying to move past the worst football game of his life. And those two things are very different beasts to try and conquer, and it's not ideal when they're coinciding with one another. Time will tell if Georgia or South Carolina has the better group of pass rushers. I shouldn't say the best, but the better group. The good news for Vandagriff, if there is any, is that it doesn't look like Mykel Williams is going to be back. I'm pretty sure he's still going to be kind of banged up for this one. Early comments from Kirby Smart. He's in a walking boot, still working his way back from the injury he suffered against Clemson. Not the full arsenal of Georgia pass rushers. I don't know that Kentucky's big blue wall, again, air quotes,
The gate.
I don't know that the big blue
turnstile.
gate. Yeah. I don't think they're licking their chops to face anyone at this point. Okay. And that's not to discredit South Carolina and what they did, but they were so overmatched, Kentucky was, on the offensive line, that there's no world in which those guys should be assuming that they're going to win one-on-ones with Georgia. They should be hopeful that the scheme is going to be tremendous, that they're going to get running backs who can pass protect, that they have Brock Vandagriff looking downfield and feeling like a guy that's confident and that can, show mobility. I would be more focused on that. You can talk about winning your one-on-ones all you want, but Kentucky will need that just to stay on the field with Georgia for 30 minutes of this one, much less 60 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I already said randomness of the sport could yield some baffling results, and watch Kentucky make this a fourth quarter game. And we'll just be like, that makes no sense whatsoever. We just watched what this program did against South Carolina, and now they're going to play 60 minutes against Georgia. Look, never rule it out. I don't see that happening. I'll take Kentucky to barely cover, but it's a 30-7 Georgia win. That isn't exactly a game that's going to make Kentucky feel particularly good. Carson Beck is going to be working, I think, with some short fields, and it's going to feel like it's over by the time they go to the break.
Yeah, and to be clear, yeah, it's a 24.5 point spread. So like there is really no moral victory in covering from any
Nope.
standpoint. I mean, we could talk about uh, what this means for Stoops and all that after the game is played. I think it all depends on how it gets played. But
Will, can
starting
I
to
ask
look,
you? Sorry to interrupt. Do you think Stoops has a pony up comment in the holster for this one, or do you think if they lose this going away, it's not going to come up?
I think that losing this game with the transfer quarterback is significantly worse than losing it without the transfer quarterback. Whenever you talk about, and I mean, granted, they technically had
Well, they had transfer quarterback last year too.
they had two different. Yeah, you're exactly right. But talking about the 5-star guy from the Blue Blood program, like when you go, there is a little bit of a, I believe, price difference between those two style of players. Even going back to Levis, it feels like I don't know, right? I don't know anything when it comes to this stuff. It's all behind the scenes, but it feels like Levis was like bargained in and it worked out for them. Then it feels like next year it was kind of like, we'll see how this goes. And then Vandergriff is pretty like, we know his name. He's been around. Those guys typically do better with NIL because they have more clout to them. So yeah, I think
I bet he was second. I bet if we're doing like starting price, which is actually like a really interesting exercise of like who was most expensive to acquire to least.
Mm-hmm.
I bet Leary was most expensive. I bet second most was Vandegrift, and then Levis was probably third.
He had to be. Yeah, I think there's a big gap between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Regardless, and 3 is Levis. But yeah, it's interesting, right? Because let me say it like this: from a PR standpoint, at least from fan standpoint, they at least know Vandergrift. Maybe they were dialed into a little bit NC State. Sure, I mean, who doesn't appreciate Tim Beck, right? But at the end of the day, like I think this is kind of you got this Viking. He's showing up from Georgia. He's here to save us, and in a way that especially with Levis or with Leary not working. So point being, I think that like this is going to be an interesting like so here's what I was going to say too. It's so rare that like we get to close the loop on a matchup the way that we will with South Carolina, Kentucky, right? Because there are truly 3 outcomes here, and by the end of this next weekend, we will know what the outcome was, right? So it was either South Carolina's pass rush is genuinely awesome, which is very possible. They're playing LSU at home. If they push around that offensive line, okay, good job, Beamer. You might have just saved your job. You have a great pass rush. Or is Kentucky unfixably broken, right? That's option 2. Is the line so trash that they're going to get pushed around to like Arkansas levels last year and like it's going to get ugly fast? Okay, that's option 2. I will present a third option, which is this the 1-3 Stoops puke on his shoes games that we tend to see every year? That's the third option and we can see that if they play well.
You're saying if South Carolina, if Kentucky, what would be the South Carolina loss we would look back as a puke on the shoes game if South Carolina gets destroyed by LSU? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying if Kentucky bounces back against Georgia and their line holds up and they look like they've played football before, and at the same time South Carolina plays well against LSU, then that was just clearly Stoops puking on his shoes. Like it was a good like matchup, but they just didn't show up ready to play. You know what I'm saying? And so like I think that's the third option that sometimes can happen with Stoops, where it's like, hey man, I don't understand this. Like sometimes there's a game where they just show up and aren't ready to play. So I think that because these 2 games are going on, you really could have an outcome where you go, yeah, I think Kentucky just wasn't ready to play last week. Like I don't think this is really like anything beyond that, because we've seen Stoops turn around seasons like that too. We saw Stoops play really well with Levis in that game that they held Georgia to like a single score game. It was an ugly game that didn't feel like Kentucky was ever really going to win, but it was like that one Levis game. I believe that was in 21.
The 21 game, they barely covered the spread because they went for it on the last play of the game, and Wandale was diving into the end zone, I remember. But it was still a game that Georgia, I believe, won by 15. It was something like that. But Kentucky barely covered because of what they did. And at the time, again, the 2021 Georgia defense,
I think I'm thinking of 22, great. The one that was like 10-16. The one that was like in the rain, like just a wire to wire slugfest
in Lexington. The entire time. Yeah. That was a very low scoring game in which Georgia was up throughout, but it was I mean, not a game that you ever felt like Kentucky was going to win though.
Yeah, like they weren't getting curb stomped, which is like likely with a 24.5, like that's a curb stomping no matter how you slice it. So all I'm saying here is that we have like those outcomes where it's like we'll be able to know about the Kentucky offensive line, the South Carolina defensive line. We'll be able to know about, this quarterback. Like, is do they have a problem with Vandegrift? You'll be able to tell against Georgia. So like it sucks that it's a matchup. Like you would think that that South Carolina was in a position to get overwhelmed by a Kentucky team that had, okay, we finally get everybody in the same room. These receivers are starting to not drop the balls often. We're starting to get on one page. Oh, just kidding. We're going to get smoked off the ball here. Is that an outlier? Because when you see Georgia, it's like Georgia is obviously going to be one of the most well-coached gap sound teams in the country, right? So it's like they're not going to make mistakes. That's one thing that Georgia, like Kirby will line up at a 3-tech if it comes down to it. If that's what it takes him to have a pass rush, he's going to do that. And so Georgia, and you're right, like Michael Williams and all that, like they really haven't had those guys post maybe like a 2021 where it comes to like, oh, the top 3 of the top 10 front 7 guys are all in Georgia. It feels like their defensive backfield has been a little bit more of their strength since then. And we kind of talked about that through all of 2022. Like who is the guy on this team that is going to fill these gaps left by, Davis and those boys. And it really just never got filled. It was kind of a group effort.
Jalen Carter.
Yeah, no, that's also very fair. Yeah, Jalen Carter did do that, but it used to be 2, 3, 4 guys. Even going back historically with Georgia, they've always had those kind of guys, and we get to learn those guys. That's the key. It's sometimes because it's a group effort, you don't get like the situation of like a Dylan Stewart, where it's like, hey, that guy might not even have the opportunity to play at Georgia. Not that he shouldn't, but he wouldn't even have the opportunity because there'd be these guys who are like in the weight program, know the plays a little bit better ahead of him. So point being, like Georgia would rather it be a group effort, right? Like, and you'd even see that with like the Alabama. It's like as much as great as like Will Anderson was, those Bama defenses were better when they were kind of like more the Jonathan Allen mold, where they had like all the front 7 guys were coming after you. So point being, I think that's the mold that Georgia's trying to build here, where it's not we're leaning on one guy, Chase Young / Bosa that's going to either generate pressure or not. And if you erase that guy, we lose. So you have to be sound when you play Georgia. You just have to. It's not erasing one guy. It's not getting lucky. It's the fact that over the course of a game, we will see the talent level, the structure, the preparedness of this team. And like I said, I just unfortunately think that it could get a little bit ugly for Kentucky if we see the same version show up against South Carolina, because you're right. Like South Carolina really did get a lot of those opportunities. They converted a lot of those opportunities where it comes to hitting the wide open guys, all that stuff. Carson Beck will not think twice about that. That's the thing. Yeah. Carson Beck is known for, and like say what you will about like the Bobo offense, but the whole scheme of the Bobo offense is don't make mistakes and hit the open guy, right? It's not even like a Monken offense where it's like, oh, you got like this middle screen going on, you got to read this guy and do this. It's like, no, we're going to throw it in slant route and a toss, and we're going to make them stop it. And if you can't stop that, which is very possible for Kentucky right now, it's gonna tell a lot about where Kentucky is, not so much Georgia.
I think there are going to be some bad optics with 3-man rushes getting home against Kentucky. And that's going to spark the questions of what is Kentucky at this point? If you can't even hold up against that, and if that's the worst thing that we're saying about you, where's the culture? Where's the identity of this program that was such a staple for such a long time for Mark Stoops? And if that group is struggling, it is definitely an indictment of where this program is at. And if they're not able to just do anything offensively, which after last week, some runs here or there, that's about it. I think that we're going to be asking some very gloomy questions about Kentucky. And with Georgia, obviously, this would be business as usual. So I don't really think that changes the conversation. But Kentucky fans are bracing for it. They're very much bracing for it. And that's why that spread is so unbelievably massive.
Yeah, for sure.